Hello, everyone. Welcome to all of you to our workshop entitled Field Notes from the Confluence of Art and Ecology. I particularly would like to welcome our students, our FLOW students. They are participating in a program that's part of the Water at UW-Madison. What do you call that? A Water at UW-Madison collaborative group?
Portfolio?
Portfolio. And so these are students across the state from different campuses that are creating art in partnership with a water professional. So Flow is this collaborative program that supports these undergraduates as they engage with these water professionals to create art created that is inspired by water. Allie, what is this number of years that you guys have been doing this?
5?
5 years. Wow, it's amazing. So my name is Ann Moser. I think I know a lot of you. I'm the education coordinator and director of the Wisconsin Water Library at UW-Madison, a member of the Water at UW faculty list. And I met Ian at the poster session for Water at UW and was just so gobsmacked by his work. He, I think, is a good example of how art and science can really beautifully come together. I'm not going to talk about it because he's going to tell you all about it during his presentation. And so he's going to talk about how he uses art to foster environmental stewardship and ecological literacy. And I think that the goal for the Water at UW staff is that the students that are doing the Flow project may leave with some new inspiration or a new framework to kind of develop their work. Before I introduce Ian, I do want to acknowledge two funding sources that is helping to make this event and the Flow project possible. I am really grateful to the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. They support myself and the work that we do in education. And I also would like to acknowledge the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources for supporting the FLOW program. So Aaron is going to do his presentation. So anytime during his presentation, please put we're doing a regular meeting, so you can throw questions into the chat. And we'll circle back at the end of his presentation and answer any questions you have. And let's make that part of the Q&A informal so people can feel comfortable asking any questions. So on to the speaker, Ian. Ian Vurick is our speaker. He's an interdisciplinary creative thinker and maker rooted in community and urban forestry. He received a BS at from UW Stevens Point and is trained in landscape architecture at the University of Oregon, where he received a master's in landscape architect. His work spans public art, installations, and data-driven environmental art, all built for environmental interpretation. And what he means by that is communicating data, natural processes, and relationships within the field of ecology. I think he'll touch a little bit upon that in his talk. All right, so I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. Okay. Welcome everybody. We are full screen and hopefully everyone can see everything. Um, yeah, so my name is Ian. I'm really excited to meet everybody and I'm looking forward to sharing some of my notes. So I am an interdisciplinary designer and artist, and my work really thrives on collaboration and evolves around the main goal of environmental interpretation and communication. So my work is really rooted in my past, like all of our creative work is. So I went to school and undergrad at UW Stevens Point for forestry. And in my core classes, I had the wonderful opportunity to do field work and really engage with research. This gave me amazing hands-on opportunities, like pictured here, where we as a class measured the water quality upstream and downstream of a beaver dam. I loved learning about ecology and tried to be a researcher, but honestly, my brain doesn't work that way. I need a little bit more creativity in my life and in my career. And so I decided to go to Oregon to study landscape architecture in the School of Design. And so it was here at the University of Oregon in Eugene that I found a collaborative community of like-minded designers and artists, all pulled together by my mentor, photographed here in the bottom corner, David Buckley Borden. My work spans projects. Oops, sorry about that. My work spans projects of all scales, like the tree guards pictured here, which are built around trees to protect the trees on a brownfield site. Um, each tree guard's form is very similar to the others. However, there's unique graphic applications on each tree guard that tell stories about the brownfield site that they're positioned on and the trees that are growing within them. Um, Another great example is the Pacific Northwest Tree ID Shield project, which uses graphic and cultural cues to explore local tree species. Um, and so what we have here is the cone of a Douglas fir, and the tools attached to those cones are PVs that are used to push fallen logs down from the Cascade Mountains through the rivers to the mills. And Doug fir is an extremely important um, timber source for Oregon and the timber industry there. And there's Blake in the corner working on some details of one of the shields. Another example of project is Ducks Unlimited. This is a project in its infancy, and really what it's trying to do is parse out the story of engineering of modern duck habitats. And finally, this summer, I had the wonderful opportunity to work on the biggest piece yet as the lead timber designer for this University of Oregon class. So we all went out to Pennsylvania and built this giant structure that was exploring Pennsylvania land use and cultural history. So I'm kind of applying this graphic retroactively to all the work that I kind of showed here. Um, but I found this graphic and I think it really speaks to things. So what my team and I have done in our work is that we um, explore multiple perspectives um, and kind of prompt visitors to consider issues in kind of a critical way. And I think that as artists working with scientists, that's kind of just a natural outcome of the work that we do if we create some sort of symbiotic relationship together. And I actually found this graphic from the National Geographic's Educators Certificate Program. And so this is a tool that educators use, and I think it's um, the parallels are really nice. So all our work s- attempts to explore different perspectives at different scales, and this is how my process works to create this work. So this work is comes from a very messy, cyclical, and iterative process. The one might call a practice, and this process that I practice to stick to when I was tasked to make a design for my master's project. So we'll see if this works. If it doesn't, that's okay. I was just curious if folks could share what they see here in this image. We can type things out too.
Literally a stump, figuratively like a fish skeleton, like large
Ooh,
dinosaur scale.
yeah,
Yeah, I'm seeing like
fish
storm
habitat.
wreckage. Yeah,
Yeah.
like a just storm recently happened.
hmm
An arrow.
Yeah, so this is exactly the question that I started to sit on and sit with. Um, after I took a class field trip to the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest. This place is research heaven. It's an amazing long-term ecological research station up in the Cascades of Oregon. And it's part of the same research network as the Trout Lake Station up north in Wisconsin here. And I think one great example of a project happening there that kind of shows or shares the feeling, the research feeling that's happening in the Cascades there is the Discovery Tree. So as you hike out to the Discovery Tree, you're hiking through this old growth forest. You might notice some cables, and those cables eventually lead to a network of cables. And that network of cables creates this beautiful web throughout the forest. And all confluences at this old growth tree called the Discovery Tree. The cables go up the Discovery Tree and they connect to sensors that are located about every 25 feet up that tree. And what they're doing is they are taking very precise measurements of the tree canopy's microclimate. Absolutely amazing. Another place we visited was the 200-year decomposition study site. This site is projected to be going on for 200 years, but it's only 41 years old right now. At first, the site just seems like any place in the old growth forest, but upon further inspection, you notice tags, flags, and housing for equipment. What was amazing to me was that this wood that I inherently knew had ecological benefits was way more than what met the eye. It's breathing, it's moving, and going through chemical and physical changes, all while teeming with and supporting life. You just need some special equipment and a lot of time to see this happening. So as we made our way down the along the Mackenzie River from H.J. Andrews to Eugene, where the university was, we passed a very big project in the ecological restoration world. This project is called the Finrock Reach Restoration Project, and it was done by the Mackenzie River Land Trust. This grand project is on the small branch of the Mackenzie River that goes through Oregon. So the Mackenzie River Land Trust harvested tons of dead and damaged trees from the recent Holiday Farm fire, and then they secured them into the ground in very careful ways to slow down the water. So they slowed down and were able to create multiple braided channels of this sort of offshoot of the Mackenzie River. This changed the sediment, the temperature, and the chemical compositions. And this braided sort of look of the river here is very similar to the way our rivers historically looked. And you can kind of see the Mackenzie River next to it as a comparison. So the Mackenzie River Land Trust saw these trees and used these trees as ecosystem engineers. They created salmon habitat within only a couple of years after the project was concluded. It was absolutely amazing. And so as I was kind of pondering and sitting on this, I was realizing that there's all these perspectives of wood in the environment. Folks see them as ecological engineers. Folks see them as living beings that this gave me inspiration to communicate about it. I wanted to create a space for visitors to consider wood in the environment from a variety of different perspectives, from the local all the way to the global level at different scales. Better yet, I wanted to incite curiosity that motivates visitors to learn about wood, appreciate it in the landscape, and advocate for its existence. And so this is where I am in the process, kind of at my initial idea. And it's time for me to kind of jump headfirst into this whirlwind of a process, into the research. And I'm a huge nerd, so I can go on tangents, but I'll try to keep things moving nice and smooth for you all. So first, I should say research does not have to mean you're reading science literature. But with my topic of wood in the environment, it's pretty nerdy, and um, it seemed like I kept veering into science literature. So as I was doing this research, I was collecting diagrams. As creatives, we collect materials. I collect diagrams because I find them extremely informative, and I draw a lot of inspiration from them through the graphics. One diagram in particular, the river continuum diagram, um, was extremely impactful for me. It illustrates that a river functions as a continuous, integrated system from the tiniest streams to the biggest rivers and eventually the ocean. To put it simply, the river is everything in the river is connected. So what happens in one spot of the river can ripple through the whole system. Now, this diagram does simplify things a bit. Um, Historically, rivers were much more dynamic. Natural log jams would occur upstream. They would dam up the stream, they would break, they would flush down and get stuck again, and the cycle would continue. This contributed greatly to the river diversity, but it made it dangerous to the nearby cities and anyone living there, and made rivers nearly impossible to navigate, especially for the industry. One industry that this was particularly a problem for was the timber industry. So lumberjacks, they were here in Wisconsin and in the Midwest, but they were quickly running out of old growth forests and trees to harvest, and so they started heading west. As they made their way west, they changed their flannels to canvas for the rain. They ditched the one-sided axe for a double-sided axe because the trees were so big that you dull your axe halfway through the cut. And they used springboards to get above the root flare because the trees were just so big. Once the trees were fell, they'd bring them to the closest water body for transportation. So the logs were pushed down the rivers to the mills, and you may recognize photos like this if you grew up in Wisconsin. But this image is a little idyllic compared to the reality of this transportation. Log jams were a common occurrence. They required poor guys called powder monkeys to use dynamite to clear obstructions. This problem was so common and expensive and dangerous that the timber industry lobbied the US government and worked with them to make rivers more traversable. This, along with splash dams, which were dams that would back up a river, they would load up that river with a bunch of logs, and then they would flush all the logs and water downstream. These practices left what we call ecologists call ecological legacies. Ecological legacies are impacts that can be felt for generations. And what these practices did is they completely altered the foundation of the natural processes of the rivers as we had known them. And this has happened so badly that not only will the rivers be changed for generations, we also don't even know exactly all the impacts that those practices had. So that's kind of the end of that sort of research tangent. But as I'm doing all this research, I am realizing, I want to be as factual and honest as possible. And when I'm taking in all this information, it's sort of circling in my head, and it may come out in ways that are, not as informative. And so I start noticing some gaps in my knowledge base, in my experience, and I make notes of different professionals that I could engage with and have help me on my project. So for this particular project, I thought it would be really helpful to reach out to some ecological restoration experts, environmental education professionals, and ecological researchers. as I do my research, I'm also taking notes of names. Um, and I think this is really important because, for example, as I was reading this literature, I started noticing Fred Swanson come up over and over and over again. And it actually happened to be that Fred Swanson was my tour guide when I visited the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest. So there was an instant connection there. The second reason I think this is valuable is that when I do eventually talk to Fred Swanson, and he may mention Stanley Gregory in conversation, I can know that he's referencing the father of river ecology in the Pacific Northwest. And that can help kind of streamline conversations. I also go through different, in the natural resources world, we might call them stakeholder websites or environmental groups, nearby nature reserves or parks. They have incredible people and incredible knowledge, and they're often very accessible information if you can't really dive into the scientific literature. So as I collect diagrams, names, I also collect vocabulary. Language is really important, I find. It shows your values. An example of that is when I first called Fred Swanson, I was talking with him. I kept calling what we've been looking at, what we saw in the picture, which I called a log. Um, I kept calling it a log, and he stopped me and he said, "Just so you know, ecologists, we call whatever you're calling a log, we call that large wood." And he would know because he actually wrote the definition of large wood. Large wood, and that's what I'll be calling it, is wood that's larger than 10 centimeters in diameter for more than 1 meter. And ecologists have different names for the wood as it changes size. And this is another example of kind of the value that we apply to things when we use language. The word log is a Middle English Old Norse word for a felled tree, specifically for the timber trade. So that denotes some sort of economic value. Whereas in the fisheries world during the 1940s and 1970s, they used the word large woody debris or woody debris to describe wood in the rivers because they had thought that the wood was obstructing salmon migration. So that debris, that also sort of evokes a sense of value or a lack of value to that wood in the environment. Another reason that vocabulary is really important is I kind of see this as like when you're visiting a new country, you try to learn a little bit of that language of the country you're going to, just as a sign of respect to streamline communication and to help folks feel like you're, respecting them. And so learning the language of the professionals you're going to be engaging with can be really important and really help solidify that relationship with them. So I've done a bunch of research, and um, now I can bring my doodles that I've been collecting while I've been researching into Photoshop. So I bring my doodles into Photoshop, and to beef them up, I make a bunch of loose ideas. Some are way better than others, but I just make them nonetheless, just to get them out there, get things moving. And I kind of see these as two-dimensional prototypes. Um, and what I do is I kind of get as many as I can, and then I refine them. So I have some of the prototypes or sketches that I like the most, and I get ready to ask for help. So that word or ask for help is maybe not the best word. I go back and forth about it because really what you could be doing is reaching out and want to share ideas, engage with professionals, and be a sponge for as much feedback and knowledge as you possibly can be. So what I do is I develop a elevator pitch, quick pitch about who I am, what my project is. I provide a timeline. I'll share some specific questions, and then some sketches or research that I find inspiring. I find that timeline is extremely helpful because professionals are extremely busy, um, and it's really nice to know what kind of deadline there may be or time frame, because that kind of allows them to anticipate how much of a commitment they can offer. In addition to that, or to conclude it all, I'll end with some sort of statement to just leave the door open. So I'll invite the professional for a phone call or a video chat. What I find this does is it allows the person to kind of decide how much they want to engage with you. You might just get an email with your specific questions answered, or you might get a more open-ended email invite or taking you up on that phone call. And the sketches are really nice because they kind of show the direction your project's going. And I see researchers as magicians, and they see us as magicians in the creative world, being able to create visual things and amass ideas together. So how I kind of see collaborators kind of in this whole process is I kind of take them along with me through this messy cycle. They may not know that they're in this cycle, but I'm kind of leading them through it. And this leads me to something very important. If there's one thing I would like to share, it's this, and that's the active reciprocity in the feedback loop. So I think that the most important thing you can do is in showing gratitude to professionals is to share your work with them, and just share updates after your conversation. So I talked with Fred Swanson for a long time, and he pointed me to some research papers that described the ecological value of large wood from the Cascades to the rivers to the ocean, and beyond. And so what I did was I created some illustrative abstracts of the papers and shared them with him, just to show appreciation and kind of in my own way, kind of like a book report of some sort. I learned this amazing fact that if wood from Oregon happens to get in the ocean and then doesn't sink to the bottom of the ocean where it supports incredible ecosystem down there, it can actually travel so far that they'll find wood from Oregon on the shores of Hawaii, which is absolutely crazy. So I see these as tools. This feedback loop is that as tools of relationship building. And I share prototypes too. This shows that you're including the professionals in the project. You're bringing them along with you, and they can get excited about the project just as excited as you are and feel engaged. Like I said before, they see us as magicians, and so sharing, even though they might be kind of crude to us, just sharing some updates can be extremely valuable and important. And I think it keeps the conversation going. So every time I share these little prototypes or drawings, I am acquiring feedback, and I'm using that feedback and knowledge and tweaking the direction that projects are going. So as you can see, this is a messy project or process, and I do skip stuff sometimes or kind of backtrack. So for example, when I am sharing my work with professionals, I refine that work before I share it. Even though I count the refine and share as sort of the final outcome of this whole process, because out of respect for time and energy and effort that the professionals are offering through their engagement, I think it's just best to refine things as much as possible. So this messy process also produces other side projects, like GPS log, where we strapped a GPS to an outfitted and highly engineered log. There's me talking to my collaborator, Cadence, who's a software engineer. And we created a website that shared live tracking data of this log for the public. bringing an overlooked ecological process of wood slowly moving downstream to the internet. And we actually had folks that were really engaged in checking in on GPS log throughout its travels. Or research methods. This is a project in its infancy. The idea is these are some simple illustrations that are celebrating research methods from projects that have happened in the Wisconsin lakes. I brought this sort of new seed of a project to the UW, the Water at UW art and poster session, and actually met some of the scientists and researchers that are in these projects. And they just lit up when they saw themselves represented in these illustrations. But it was with this final, this arboreal angler here that something clicked. This prototype, there's something about it that people immediately saw it, they smiled, and then they asked for more information. They asked, what is this thing? And on top of that, it sort of tied together all these sort of ideas I was juggling in my head and in my research into one object. We have the material culture of logging materials. We have the form of the lure. Anglers are an extremely sort of important advocate for river ecology restoration and in water ecosystem restoration projects. And we have the ecology represented in the painting of this arboreal angler, which I painted to look like a cutthroat trout. It kind of goes back to my reciprocity sort of process, where this actually is the favorite fish of a researcher I talked with at H.J. Andrews. If there's one thing I learned about going to Stevens Point, it's that most wildlife biologists and fishery biologists, they have that one organism that they are just love so much. So it's always a great way to kind of make a connection. So it's kind of at this point, which I think is the absolute hardest part. We had our side projects, but I finally hit that gold where we had this project that kind of tied everything together. And I knew this in my heart that it was time to kind of move on from the iterative process of prototyping. But it was really hard to let go. I even had advisors saying, "All right, this is it, Ian. It's time to start working on this on these arboreal anglers." And so I let my collaborators and advisors know that it was time for me to move on from the books and the keyboard to the wood shop. But even though I was in the wood shop, I still sent updates, again, to receive feedback and create some discussion prompts. These little kind of touch points, they seem to help keep the ball moving and help add layers of ideas to projects. So I'd share things like this. And this process and this act of reciprocity throughout your project, it really like creates a community of folks. So for example, most of this wood is from peeler cores, a byproduct of a lumber mill, a local lumber mill in Oregon. But before I had access to peeler cores, I was noticing one of the UO grounds crew cutting up a tree. And so I asked him if I could have some of the wood. And we developed this little thing where he would just stash wood for me behind a bush and I'd go and collect it. And eventually he let me go to the brush pile and I could just sort through the wood myself. Um, but yeah, just that being kind to folks and sharing your ideas and your projects with them. So I was able to, with these prototypes, secure funding to build out the project of the Arboreal Angler Collection. I was able to lead a team of interdisciplinary designers and artists through the construction process of these arboreal anglers. And you might notice these little like yellow accents on the lures. This is another thing, just being open to whoever may come by. So our billing manager was inspecting our studios to make sure they were approved for fire code. And he saw my project in the prototypes. And the next day he showed up with his fly tying gear and taught me how to tie lures. And from there, I was able to start adding accents to all the lures and then share those updates with him and kind of create that sort of cyclical reciprocity cycle with him. So it was through my relationships that I developed with the Mackenzie River Land Trust. And that was a tough one because I actually went through 3 different phone calls with different folks, trying to find just the right person that was willing to engage with me. It was through this relationship that we had the wonderful opportunity of installing the project in the public and in situ on the banks of the Willamette River. Check out that large wood behind the piece. Awesome. So folks could hike out to the site. And with the help of Sam, an environmental educator that I worked with, we designed this piece like an educational poster. So I've heard different ways of this rule being described, but there's this poster rule that's like the 1, 5, and 10-second rule. So in the first second of viewing something, you want to capture your visitor's attention. Hopefully they can get an idea of what's going on in 5 seconds. And then if you are really good at capturing their curiosity, they might spend 10 seconds or more trying to understand and explore whatever you're sharing with them. And so in this work, I used colors and forms to capture the attention from down the trail, drawing people to the site. They'll notice all the different details and find like something familiar in the form of the lures. If they're curious enough, they'll go to the interpretive station that we had set up next to the project, where we were handing out posters that had the names and images of all the different anglers and a booklet. This booklet uses stories, aesthetics, and names from lure collecting books to show that each lure represents a different organism that is somehow connected to large wood. So here you can kind of see the anatomical similarities between the lure and then the actual organism. Also in the book, folks can see that the lure's hardware is derived from old logging equipment, and that the wood that was used was actually waste from a lumber mill. And if they want to learn even more about the project, they can read the individual stories of each lure that is on the site, and move up and down the river continuum. So we have a group of anglers from the terrestrial side of things. The surfing sallies are reproductions of the tasty Oregon ensentina, a predatory salamander found hunting for grub and decomposing wood. The ensentina spends most of its time under the protection of decaying wood, only resurfacing on warm and rainy nights. It is on these nights that bass may opportunistically feed elusive salamanders. We have the river and lake group. The coaxing caddy. The coaxing caddy is a favorite for growing salmon fry, which need to be coaxed out of their protective hiding places made by large wood. Use this lure in deep pools made by jammed wood in streams. This is a reproduction of a caddisfly. The sharp-tongued chub. Luckily, the sharp-tongued chub cannot talk, but if it could, it would surely be disappointed with the lack of natural chub habitat today. Chub prefer beaver ponds, backed up channels, and other slow-moving floodwaters to feed and breed. With dredging and channelization of riparian areas, the natural processes and habitat which the chub rely on are few and far between. The marine, so the wood going all the way out into the ocean, the all-in-one amphipod, feathers, kinetic parts, hooks, and sinkers. This amphipod lure has it all. This heavyweight champion needs to go deep down to the bottom of the sea, where sunken wood provides food for Henerodia gigas, a wood-eating amphipod. These amphipods can catch a diverse range of deep-sea predators. And finally, some cultural lures. These kind of lures represent different cultural points in the story of large wood. So, for example, the powdered polywog. From the 1850s to the 1930s, lumber companies practiced steam improvements, which often used dynamite to clear river obstructions such as log jams and boulders. The workers responsible for the dynamite were called powder monkeys. Aquatic habitats were obliterated by these practices. And so there's even another level of detail, which is just found in the language and in the names of each of the lures. And they really string together a quite nuanced story. When all these anglers are together, they tell a very rich story about ecology, local history, culture, um, at different scales, from the global to the local level, and add a level of nuance and understanding that I by myself could not do. Um, I needed a group of collaborative professionals. So people were spending time reading the stories, looking for each of the lures, giggling at their names, and eagerly engaging with the pieces. And it was it's a fun project in itself that folks weren't totally sure if it was being critical or what it was being critical of until they started to dive into the reading. And I think what that does is it opens some sort of door to let their guard down. So I had folks that were really big in, they actually had a forester come up and talk with me, and he felt seen because he saw all these tools that he had seen his like grandpa use. I had anglers come up to me and talk about the different lures they're making. It kind of spanned a whole spectrum of different perspectives. And I think one of the most rewarding parts of this experience was when Fred stopped by and visited. He's seen there in the yellow jacket. He was just overjoyed to see what our relationship working together developed, but also to see his body of work being represented in accessible and new ways that he could never imagine happening. And for him to actually see people engaging with his work in this unique and novel way, I think it gave him new perspectives on artist and science relationships and how a symbiotic relationship like this can really help communicate complex ecological and cultural issues. My final sort of sharing of gratitude always comes in this long list. Of course, there's the funding with the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest, Mackenzie River Land Trust, and the Fuller Initiative for Productive Landscapes. But then there's all the folks that helped me out and worked on this project. Jeffrey Billington, the building manager that taught us how to tie lures, the UO facilities for letting me dig through their brush pile, Asa DeWitt, who spent the whole summer with me working on the lures. It's a little odd for artists to list all their contributors, but that's something that's really common in the scientific world. And so that's kind of my way of sharing my appreciation for those scientists and researchers that I engage with. So through this really sort of chaotic process, I was able to take this ecological concept, iterate it with the help of collaborators and professionals from a whole spectrum of backgrounds, and eventually come up with this piece that really spoke to the nuance of um, wood in the environment and the complex ecological value that it has. And hopefully just learning a little bit more about this project has helped, um, change your perspective a little bit too. Thank you. Please feel free to check out my website if you would like to read more stories about the arboreal anglers or see the other projects. And then for all the artists out there, please follow me on Instagram if you're able to do so. I would love to see all the work that you're making and create that community with you. Thank you.
Yay. I think we should all say bravo to Ian. That was really great. I'm going to open it up to ask questions, but I just wanted to share something that I observed. It's not a question for you, but I've been thinking about I did art history as an undergrad and now work in science, and I've had a really hard time articulating how these two disciplines can start at the beginning. But I felt that your process diagram very much
Hmm.
reminded me of science. Was
Mm.
that something that your goal of putting that document together, that diagram together, is that a diagram that's out in the public, or was that something you created?
That is something I created, and I am a collector of diagrams, so there's certainly a
Mhm.
possibility I was inspired by other diagrams. But it really is the outlining of like a interdisciplinary, or not interdisciplinary, an iterative design process.
Mhm.
Um, and that process is very scientific. So there's definitely a connection there, um, that I've definitely noticed myself as well.
Well, I talked with an artist once who shared that he wants scientists to work with artists at the very beginning, not to
Hmm.
come to them and say, I want to communicate your science. Instead, at the beginning of a scientific
Yeah,
project. And so you captured that really beautifully.
yeah, thank you.
Um, thank you. I'd like to open it up to other questions, or if someone here has a favorite fish they can share with the group, that would be wonderful too. Anybody? I don't see any questions in the chat, but Greta, please, I'd love to hear your question for Ian.
It's less of a question and more of just a comment. I think it's like kind of how Anne was mentioning, like um how you have like a scientific method almost applied to the way you like gathered research. You looked at what other like resources were out there to approach this
Hmm.
art piece. Because I think like with this project, I have basically only been in contact with my water professional, just like having conversations. Um, but it does kind of make me like think I should reach out to a few more people just to like even have them look at my piece because at this point it's a little further along now to like incorporate more stuff. But I just think that's like really interesting.
Yeah, and I also had, a whole year of relationship building too. So that's definitely something that just with if you work on a project for a long time that you can start to accumulate. And sharing work with your I consider sharing my work with my fellow designers as also just a really important part of engaging and getting feedback, and learning more about your project. Um, so even if you can't reach out to researchers and get them in early, just the folks around you, I think is really valuable.
All right, I'll throw a question out. So, hey, and great project, pretty cool
Yeah, thank
stuff.
you.
Just wondering about GPS log.
Yeah,
That really reminded me of kind of early stream hydrology research when they just painted
yep,
rocks and threw them in and then saw where they went. So, how
yeah.
far did GPS log go, and how would you refine it in the
Oh my
future?
gosh. Yeah, thank you so much for asking that question. I'm just going to scroll up to it because I do believe that the final picture has the total. So we GPS log traveled 1.5 miles, which this project was inspired by a story by Fred Swanson, who shared a similar story about throwing things in the water and just watching, like counting them as they move downstream. Um, he told me I would be lucky if I got it like a couple hundred feet out of GPS log. And so I was really excited to see it went so far, but I did have to apply or do some maintenance on it, for batteries and stuff like that. So in the future, if I was doing this project again, which I really do hope to do so, I would definitely have a better battery sort of system so that the GPS can stay active longer, um, and that it can, so I'm not like interacting with it nearly as much. But also, I think bigger. Um, the problem with going bigger is that the logs will get stuck as they move down, but that's also part of the ecological process and the story that's being told. Yeah. there's a lot of things. This website's still up, and I actually have described, there's sort of the engineering and the design of this GPS log, and I believe there's a list of things I would like to update and change to make things a little bit more smooth. And I would be really excited to bring this to the Midwest. I think that'd be outstanding.
Well, a few years ago, when we had really high water levels in Lake Michigan,
Hmm.
Lake Huron, that was like lots of trees ended up in the lake. And I did think
Hmm.
about that. I was like, it'd be great to throw some kind of, you know, transmitter on this and see where all these trees go because, they're out there somewhere.
Yeah, yeah, and it's difficult. I did a lot of research on GPSs, and I found this was the best way to go for what we were trying to do. But yeah, it can be difficult to engineer it for sure.
Yeah, look at acoustic tags next time. That could be
I thought about that, but I didn't want to have to be driving up and down the road and updating the location like that.
that's the downside.
Yeah.
Thanks, Titus. Allie, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for your insight.
Mhm.
It was a great talk. And I also found the way that you sort of like articulated the way that collaboration played in the later parts of your process, like when you needed
Mhm.
help and the iterative feedback and stuff.
Mhm.
I'm kind of curious because you seem like a super interdisciplinary person who moves really fluidly through these ideas like independently. So
Mhm.
I'm kind of curious on that very beginning part of your process, like when you decide to make the movement and why maybe from collaborating with ideas and diagrams and concepts to humans and like why you pull in a human to have a conversation. And maybe it's all in pursuit of the eventual feedback loop, but I was wondering if you could sit in that beginning process and talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I do think in the end, it's all about this sort of feedback
Mhm.
loop that is created. Um, and honestly, I find that I like to dive into the research a lot more than other folks do. And I'll literally, not literally, almost literally hit a wall where like my just level of understanding just kind of breaks down, and I need to really reach out to folks. Um, and I'm trying to learn how to do that earlier because I think when you get folks in earlier, it really starts the process a lot faster. And then they're also able to like gear you a little bit more. So you can kind of have your blinders on a bit and not have to just be taking in all this research information. Um, and so for me, yeah, it came to this point where I was just really feeling like I had a very great understanding as much as I could, and that I needed to reach out to folks. But it's a practice to try to do that earlier.
Mhm.
Can I ask
Does
a
that
quick
answer your question?
follow-up? It
Yeah.
absolutely it does.
Okay.
Reflecting on the flow program and how we've
Hmm.
designed this, it's really
Hmm.
different to the process that you laid out because, I mean, yes, it is because we start with artists and we provide them like a list of water professionals with a very short blurb about what
Hmm.
they do. And then the students kind of pick what they're sort of interested in. But it's like instead of starting with the concept and the idea and the research, it's almost like we're kind of like putting the pair together first and then
Yeah.
seeing what emerges. So I don't know if
Hmm.
you have any, and you're kind of saying you're trying to move earlier in that process. Do you have any comments or remarks from from the positionality of a practicing artist on what that would look like when you kind of start
Yeah,
with this like almost
definitely.
matchmaking internet
Yeah.
connection?
So that's actually a fantastic follow-up because it does sort of speak to something, which is when I do reach out to folks, it's after I kind of have a good feeling that like, I know some of the vocabulary. I know what questions I need to ask. I have a background of information. In teaching sort of this sort of design process with other students, I find that the same ideas happen over and over again because you have these students that may not have done all that research, and so they're just kind of picking the thing that gets them excited, which is great. However, it does sort of get kind of repetitive over time. And I think that the flow program sort of sets up the students to sort of skip that step, because instead of doing their own research and kind of settling on the first sort of interesting concept that they find, they're kind of paired with it right away. And it may be geared towards sort of more nuanced stories or knowledge that they may not have found on their own.
Cool. Thanks for your insight.
Yeah.
I don't see any other questions, but anybody else want to chime in? You can just unmute yourself if you'd like. Anybody?
All right, I'll throw it. This is kind of a comment. So I'm on my fourth flow project pair
Yeah.
up now as a water scientist, and I think the like how I've approached it has changed over time. From like the first time I was like, well, this is what I want to get out of it, and
Mhm.
then what we kind of produced in the end with the artist was not what I had in mind. And
Yeah.
since then, I've just been like, hey, here's some ideas. Like this is all the stuff.
Yeah.
And go nuts and come back. And, I think that really has produced things that are really neat and not that I would have, thought of. So yeah, I think being open to it is a great way to go.
I 100% agree. As you can see through my process, it is very like iterative. I throw out a bunch of things and then I refine, refine, refine. And yeah, when you're doing that, I think it allows the artist to kind of pick the direction that they want to go. And um, I followed up for this presentation. I followed up with some of the professionals that I had engaged with for this project. Just like asked them what their experience was, what worked really well for them, what didn't, and they felt so excited to sort of see. They would throw out all these ideas and then see the thing that I latched onto and how that kind of evolved and turned into something completely different. It really turns into its own living project.
That's great. And I appreciate people putting their favorite fish in the
Oh, yes.
yeah, so we've got a couple of Mackenzie River fish is the red band trout.
Ooh.
Allie, you should pronounce that one.
It's not a fish, and it's a
Oh.
plant.
Okay. Oh, of course.
Which Titus called habitat. At least you didn't say lake weeds, Titus.
Something else I'm thinking about, Ian, as you've been talking, which I think is really interesting, is I think maybe one of the ways that artists can work with scientists that might really be beneficial is every time I turn around with you, you're asking questions of me. And I hope that maybe when you work with scientists, that might I think scientists ask a lot of questions, but maybe an artist can bring in another angle to it, like,
Yeah.
because the artists that I've ever interacted with are so curious from every single one. They're always curious, curious, curious. So those questions that you ask and other artists ask, that could really benefit scientists, I think, in
Yes,
science in general. And
Yeah.
science is benefiting, I think, you as in terms of an artist. So it's kind of a nice benefit.
Yeah,
both
that's
ways.
really why I call it a symbiotic relationship, because both parties really do benefit immensely from that relationship and find new perspectives through the work.
It is coming on 1 o'clock, 5 o'clock. So I just wanted to ask if there was any more questions. I see people are kind of fading away. It's the end of the day. Watch that chat. What's going on over there? So I really want to thank you, Ian. That was really fantastic. I just really feel like I got a new insight in how art and science can really benefit each other and intersect really beautifully. So thank you. Everybody give him a round of applause. And if you're still a Flow student online, and I'm sure Eric and Allie will contact you, but I think our next round with Ian, our one-on-one looks at your art, and I think I hope you think that he'll give you some really good feedback, because I think he has a lot to share. So I think Allie and Eric will probably share the link with you to sign up. So be sure to not miss that. Any other things from Eric or Allie?
Nope, that's all good. Thanks for coming,
All
folks.
right. Yeah. And thank you, Ian. That was really great.
Yes, of course. Thank you.
Yeah.